So I've noticed when I tell people that I read 2 to 5 books most weeks, people often react in awe or incredulity and frustration. Hey, I can't read that much. And often those same people will, if I tell them, or I mention, like, I count novellas, if they're independently published in a single binding, I count them as a book, they will sort of narrow their eyes and they'll be like, wait, what do you count as a book read? And that question, I feel like, is illustrative, symptomatic of, I think, why a lot of people have trouble reading today, which is that they have this idea that a book needs to be a thick, serious book to count. And they're sort of going for that. And I talked about that a bit when I talked about The Alchemist, which is actually number 2 on the list. If I'm going to have a dozen books I'm going to suggest at the end, is that I think a lot of people who have their identity as a reader and I need to read more, right, they feel like it's not serious unless it's a thick, difficult book. But a lot of the best books are short, or at least a lot of the books I think are the best books are fairly short. And books should be as long as they need to be to convey the idea they're conveying. And some books may be so short you can put a bunch of them in a single volume. Some books are so long that they're generally split by publishers. But just make the book as long as it needs to be for what it is. And I don't like books that pad themselves unnecessarily. And I think a sign of a good writer is being able to get things as short as possible. And a lot of these books I'm going to share are popular books and have enduring popularity, and I think that's for a reason. But to answer the question that people ask, so this is something I never really thought about until people asked me. In a similar way, I never thought about how many books I read because I wasn't counting until people asked me. And the reason I give a week-by-week basis is I'm not tracking my books. I just, every so often I'll think about it and I'll be like, how many books did I read last week? And it's, most of the time it's 2 to 5, unless either I'm reading a lot of short books, in which case it might be over 5, or I haven't been reading much, in which case it might be 1 or less, or it's a thick, dense book and I have been reading less than normal, in which case it might also be 1 or less. Aside from that, it's pretty much always within about 2 to 5 for me. Similarly, again, if it's published in its own binding, I count it as a book. If I don't finish it, I think of the average book as being about 240 to 360 pages. So if it's 300 pages of other material, I count that as a book read. But I wasn't really even thinking about it until people ask, because it's not really how I'm measuring things. I'm evaluating books by their usefulness, not by their length, not by their quantity. And it might seem sort of weird to say, okay, but I'm recommending short books. It's because I think there is this stigma around reading short books. So I wanted to recommend a dozen of those. And I'm going to start with Kahlil Gibran's The Prophet, which is one of the best-selling, most translated books of all time. This is a series of short, original parables. So Kahlil Gibran was a Lebanese Christian who immigrated to the US, and he wrote these based on sort of Sufi ideas. And this is like a great example of what I call a getting out of my own head book, as are some of these others. And it's beautiful writing, it's uplifting. So yeah, I strongly recommend The Prophet. And then the next one, as I already revealed, is The Alchemist, which, again, I have a video on that because people who don't read a lot tend to love this book. People who read like as much as I do tend to love this book. But there is a big community of people who consider themselves readers and read a moderate amount who really hate it. And I think it's because of this idea that books should always challenge you in ways that feel challenging. They should always have detailed world building and characters, which are not in this book. And I feel like that's missing the point of the book. And then next we have Aesop's Fables, which, depending on the collection, is not necessarily short. This one from Peter Popper Press is. And I feel like these are important lessons that are in common speech, but a lot of people don't know them today. I'll probably talk more about Aesop's Fables because these are important ideas, but even though it's a collection of short fables, I really feel like more people should read this. I read these a bunch as a kid, and I reread them as an adult because they are, especially if you're going beyond the surface level. And one thing is, a lot of these have morals. The original ones didn't. And the explicit morals are not always what the story is trying to convey. And then the next one is Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I was reluctant to read this one because it's about his time in the Nazi death camps, and that part is kind of hard to read. But this has appealed to a lot of people for a reason. And Frankl himself was like, it's concerning that so many people are reading this book. But I feel like if you can get over what the material is, and you're struggling in this world, this is a really useful book to read. And then next, and I definitely put this one after Frankl for the play on words, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is a book. The first few chapters are hard to get into. So there's a prologue that's on the ice, and there's a few chapters. And then once you get into it, I feel like it's really interesting, really compelling, and it's short. And this is a Wordsworth Press one that was cheap that I got because I loved the cover they used for this. And then next, so this is something Amazon recommended to me for a long time, and I put it off because it sounded sort of like New Agey woo. And then I read, and I'm like, oh, there is a bit of New Agey woo, but if you get over that, the advice is actually really solid, is this book, The Four Agreements. And again, short book. It's usually like $5 on Amazon. And again, you can get over the fact that he's claiming this is like ancient Toltec mystic wisdom and just look at the actual advice. It is really solid advice that I think is pretty solidly expressed. His writing isn't amazing, but I definitely would actually recommend this book. And then I have 2 books by C.S. Lewis, which I got down from 3. But one of them is fiction, one is nonfiction, and I'm going to recommend the fiction one first, which is his book, The Great Divorce. And this is C.S. Lewis making a case for basically how the Christian idea of eternal damnation could still be from a loving God, I guess. But I feel like it's a great manual for life. This is a story about the afterlife, but it's also as like a way to think about how you're living. The ideas in this book are fantastic, and I would strongly recommend it to anyone. And I'm a Quaker, but I'm not a Christian, but I would recommend it to, obviously, Christians. I would also recommend it to people who are not religious. Again, I think the advice for the afterlife in this book also applies to the day-to-day in this life. And then we have this one, The Abolition of Man, which is really short. And actually, I have another one I was going to put at number 4, and I forgot to, and I'll grab that one. And this is really interesting. There's a lot of stuff in it that is even more relevant today. And it is, so this is actually the book that I was going to recommend fourth, is the Daodejing, which this is the comic version, but it is very readable in just any translation you find. It is probably the best known ancient Chinese text in the West, or the most read for good reason. And the advice is vague, or it sounds vague, but that's the point. It's simple in idea, but in execution it's the execution that matters, and it sort of gets you thinking about that. And of the Taoist texts, I have 2 that I like better, but this is, I think, the most universally accessible, and you don't need the comic version. You can get a regular version. I have a couple of those, but they're in larger volumes. And so again, this book he is basically talking about the Tao as sort of the way the world works. So C.S. Lewis, even though he was a Christian, was very interested in like ideas in general. And this book is, I'm probably going to talk about it in the future, but it's worth reading, and it is very short. It is how many pages? 110 pages. So, and then this book is the only one that is above 200 pages on this list. It's 201 pages, I think. So this is the book that I wish I'd read after my father died, and I didn't read it until several years after. And it was after Alliston Bechdel's graphic novel Funhouse. This is probably the book that has helped me most in terms of coming to terms with my father's death. But I think there's good lessons for life in this one as well. And then this is the first one that's, everything after this is going to get a little bit less general maybe, but I still think it is relevant. So next we have John Gray, Feline Philosophy, and I've mentioned liking John Gray before. This is one of his shortest books, and it is a really interesting book about basically things that we take for granted as moral universals. A cat would not see the same way, and it's hard to describe, but I recommended a bunch of books to a friend, and this was her favorite book of all the books that I recommended, and she liked a lot of them. And it is probably my favorite John Gray book as well. So this book is 110 pages. So again, very short. And even though it sounds niche, I absolutely recommend reading this book. If you have really any, if you're watching these videos, you would probably like this book. And then the next we have Finite and Infinite Games by James Carse, which again, this is, so James Carse was a religious studies scholar at NYU, I believe. NYU or Columbia, some New York university. And this one I can't really even, I'm going to talk about in other videos. I can't really summarize it succinctly here. But it's, well, basically the idea is, so you have finite games which are played to win, and infinite games which are to keep people in the game. And that's the premise that he builds on from that. And then related to that, we have Martin Buber's I and Thou, which I recommend reading don't try to understand what he's saying. Read it like it's poetry and see what you get out of it. And this is what the translator Walter Kaufman recommended as well. If you try to read it and understand, you are going to be very frustrated. But if you're just reading it like poetry, I think this is an amazing book, and you will get probably more out of it than if you were trying to understand everything. And then we have Camus, which this one, I was surprised by how much I liked this, and the same friend who liked feline philosophy was surprised that I liked it. But it's a novel about basically a man, he's condemned to death, and he realizes there's a sort of freedom in it. It's hard to explain, but I did not think I'd like it, because I don't like a lot of what French philosophy often does, but I really liked this one. And it's short, which is why I picked it, recommend it. And then we have, so I have, this one is a 2-book volume. It's public domain. A lot of these books are public domain, and you can get them on Project Gutenberg. Heretics by G.K. Chesterton. And I like Orthodoxy too, but Heretics, I was blown away by some of the observations he made in this book. And so Orthodoxy was a sequel to Heretics. And the Heretics is, in this volume anyways, it's 165 pages, and it's 20 essays, so they're all pretty short essays. And there's some really perceptive stuff in here. But Chesterton is, I don't know how accessible he is to everyone, especially today, but I think he's accessible enough that I'm still going to recommend it. And then finally, and this one looks thick, but it's within this. This is the easiest way to get it, is in this thick Penguin collection. But it's the book called Fictions, which consists of 2 parts, which has most of his best-known stories. And as I said in my video on things that are hard to read, supposedly, the ideas in them are hard, but his writing style is actually very accessible, and I very much recommend Fictions within this book, and it's probably under 100 pages. And so those are 12 short books that I recommend to get you started if you're wondering what you might read as short books. But again, the main point of this video was, I think it is worth reading short books, and I think people often become their own enemies when they're trying to define worthwhile books by the length or difficulty. Anyways, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.